They were mothers, daughters, nurses, neighbors. The kind of women you'd wave to across the street, borrow sugar from, or trust with your children. They walked among us without suspicion, dressed in the ordinary, masked in familiarity. They smiled at strangers. They offered comfort to the weak. They whispered prayers and promised care. But behind locked doors and sterile hospital rooms, in shadowed kitchens and quiet bedrooms, they committed acts so cold, so brutal, that entire communities were left gasping in their wake. No one suspected the woman in scrubs would quietly stop a heartbeat with a syringe. No one imagined a young girl would stab her best friend nearly 500 times. No one foresaw that the woman standing vigil beside her terminally ill husband would bring a gun instead of flowers. One murdered veterans who had served their country. Another suffocated children she was paid to protect. One buried her boarders beneath her garden. Their methods were different, but they all shared something chilling. None of them looked like killers, and that's what makes these stories impossible to forget. These aren't campfire tales or courtroom legends from long ago. These women are real. Their crimes are recent. Their victims had names. And the justice that followed came too late for many. In the next few minutes, you'll hear the facts, the calls for help, the confessions, the chilling testimonies, and the moments where evil wore a familiar face. This is not a story of strangers in the night. This is the truth about 10 American women, once trusted, now caged, whose crimes shook the nation. Before we begin, if you're drawn to true stories that uncover the chilling truths hidden behind ordinary faces, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, because the next name we reveal might be someone you never suspected. Case number 1. Heather Pressdee. Heather Pressdee looked like the kind of nurse you'd trust with your loved ones. Compassionate, dedicated, always ready with a smile and a kind word. But behind the hospital curtains of Pennsylvania's nursing homes, something far darker was happening. In 2022, 52-year-old Pressdee, a licensed nurse, began administering insulin to her elderly patients. But this wasn't treatment. This was death. Over the course of a year, she was convicted of 3 murders, but the true toll of her actions goes far deeper. Authorities linked her to the deaths of at least 17 victims, spanning 5 different nursing homes. Her first confirmed victim was Alma Walker, a 78-year-old woman found dead after a suspicious insulin overdose. Then came Richard Spencer, 82, and Beverly Mack, 79, both found with signs of insulin-induced hypoglycemia, an overdose that mimics the natural decline of old age. For months, Pressdee's colleagues were unaware, thinking these deaths were merely part of the grim nature of nursing homes. But when an investigation finally began, a chilling pattern emerged. Nurses started noticing that patients under Pressdee's care seemed to die at an unusually high rate, especially after she administered their insulin. By the time she was caught, Heather had already poisoned dozens of others, though only 3 could be definitively linked to her. Pressdee justified her actions, claiming she was ending their suffering and helping them die with dignity. But prosecutors weren't moved by her excuse. To them, her actions were clear, pure evil. They called her a cold-blooded killer who took advantage of the elderly and vulnerable under her care. In court, it was revealed that Pressdee had a history of violent behavior, including previous instances of being reprimanded for improperly handling medication. But even that didn't explain her cold, calculated decision to end lives for what she seemed to consider a mercy. In the end, she was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each of the victims she murdered, and an additional 760 years for her role in the deaths of the 17 others she was connected to. Heather Pressdee, the nurse who was supposed to heal, is now serving time behind bars for the unspeakable horrors she inflicted. Case number 2. Rita Mays. In the quiet corridors of the Louis A. Johnson Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia, patients found solace and care. Among the dedicated staff was Rita Mays, a 46-year-old nursing assistant and former Army National Guard member. She was known for her calm demeanor and commitment to her duties, often working the night shifts when the hospital was most tranquil. But between July 2017 and June 2018, a disturbing pattern emerged. Elderly veterans, admitted for various non-life-threatening ailments, began dying unexpectedly during the night. The common thread: all had suffered sudden, severe drops in blood sugar, hypoglycemia, despite no history of diabetes or insulin prescriptions. The victims included Felix McDermott, 82, a retired Army sergeant; Robert Edge Sr., 81, Robert Kozul, 89, Archie Edgell, 84, a Korean War veteran; George Shaw, 81, W.A.H., 85, Raymond Golden, 88. An eighth veteran, whose name was not publicly released, survived an attempted insulin overdose. Investigations revealed that Mays had been injecting these patients with insulin, a medication she was neither authorized nor qualified to administer. Her actions were deliberate and malicious, exploiting the trust placed in her by both the institution and the patients she was meant to care for. In July 2020, Mays pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. During sentencing in May 2021, U.S. District Judge Thomas Klee described her as the monster that no one sees coming, emphasizing the calculated nature of her crimes. Mays offered no clear motive for her actions, leaving families and investigators grappling with unanswered questions. She was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms, plus an additional 20 years, ensuring she will spend the remainder of her life in prison. The case prompted a thorough review of the hospital's practices, leading to significant changes aimed at preventing such tragedies in the future. Yet for the families of the victims, the pain remains, a stark reminder of the betrayal by someone entrusted with their loved one's care. Case number 3. Kaye Brackett. In the small coastal town of Perry, Maine, surrounded by serene wilderness and the deep-rooted traditions of the Passamaquoddy tribe, neighbors looked out for one another. Life moved slowly. Trust was woven into the fabric of the community. But in April of 2022, that trust was torn apart in the most horrific way imaginable. Kimberly Neptune was 43 years old. A proud member of the Passamaquoddy Pleasant Point Reservation, she was known by those around her for her warm spirit, her laughter, and her deep love for family. But on April 21st, her brother arrived at her apartment after days without contact. What he discovered would haunt him forever. Kim lay still, wrapped tightly in a blanket on her living room floor. The crime scene was soaked in silence and soaked in blood. It was immediately clear that this wasn't a random act of violence. It was intimate, ferocious, rage-filled. An autopsy would later reveal the full horror: 484 stab wounds. Her body had been punctured hundreds of times in a sustained, almost ritualistic attack. With injuries to her head, neck, torso, and legs, she had no chance to survive. Investigators quickly focused their attention on a person from within Kim's own circle, Kaye Brackett, a 38-year-old woman with a turbulent past. Brackett wasn't just a name in a file. She was a former friend, someone Kim had trusted, someone she had let into her life. But underneath that facade was a growing storm: jealousy, drug addiction, and deep-seated resentment. Over time, Kaye had become convinced, without evidence, that Kim had stolen money from her. This accusation, possibly rooted in drug-fueled paranoia and deteriorating mental health, became the spark. Witnesses told investigators that Brackett had been talking about revenge, saying she wanted to make Kim pay. On the night of April 20th, surveillance footage captured a hooded figure approaching Kim's apartment. Prosecutors later confirmed it was Brackett. Inside the apartment, the violence that unfolded was unspeakable. Investigators believe that Brackett brought a knife with her, Whether she intended to intimidate Kim or kill her from the beginning, no one knows for certain. But once the stabbing began, it didn't stop. Wound after wound, until Kim lay lifeless. But Kaylee wasn't alone that night. Donald Dana, her ex-boyfriend and the father of her child, was later implicated. It's believed he helped cover up the murder, disposing of evidence and helping Brackett evade immediate suspicion. Dana had once lived with Kim, adding yet another layer of betrayal. He later accepted a plea deal for hindering apprehension. The courtroom, months later, was filled with heartbreak. Family members described Kim as generous and nurturing, someone who made others feel safe. Her nieces and nephews sobbed as they recalled her role as a second mother. Her community, still reeling, showed up in force. Brackett showed little remorse. She denied responsibility throughout the trial, deflecting blame and suggesting that another suspect was still out there. But the evidence told a different story: DNA, surveillance, witness accounts. The jury saw through it all. In 2024, she was sentenced to 55 years in prison for the brutal murder. The judge called the act beyond comprehension and said it represented one of the most excessive uses of violence he had seen in his career. Kimberly Neptune's family will never be the same. Each year, they honor her life with candlelight walks and memorial dinners. They speak her name often, refusing to let her be remembered solely by the way she died, but by how she lived, full of light, laughter, and compassion. And yet, the question lingers. How could a friend become a killer? How could jealousy and anger turn into 484 stab wounds? The answers may never come, but the scars on her family, on her community, and on the soul of that small Maine town remain. Case number 4. Ellen Gilland. It was a quiet Saturday morning at Advent Health Hospital in Daytona Beach, Florida. The hum of fluorescent lights, the rhythmic buzz of medical equipment, everything seemed routine. But on January 21st, 2023, room 1106 became the setting of a heartbreaking and morally complex tragedy, one that would leave nurses trembling, patients in shock, and a nation grappling with questions that have no easy answers. Inside the room, Ellen Gilland, a 76-year-old woman with neatly combed white hair and a solemn demeanor, stood by her husband's bedside. Jerry Gilland, 77, was lying in the bed, terminally ill and rapidly declining from complications related to a chronic illness. According to Ellen, they had made a pact, one rooted in love, despair, and a shared wish to die with dignity. If his suffering became unbearable, he wanted out, and she had promised to help him. They had no children. They were each other's whole world. And for years they had quietly discussed the idea of a planned, mutual end should one of them be forced to face slow, agonizing decline. But when the moment finally came, reality clashed violently with the hypothetical. That morning, Ellen brought a revolver into the hospital tucked inside her handbag. She sat next to her husband, alone with him. She later told detectives he gave her a signal, and so she pulled the gun from her purse and shot him in the head. But the plan, so carefully discussed, so emotionally rationalized, fell apart in an instant. Ellen had planned to shoot herself next. That was the agreement. But as Jerry lay dead, something shifted. She hesitated. The shock, the fear, the irreversible nature of what she had just done. She stood frozen in the room, gun still in hand. Staff and patients nearby heard the gunshot. Within seconds, hospital security locked down the 11th floor. Nurses and doctors were evacuated. Patients wheeled away. SWAT was called in. The quiet hospital floor turned into a negotiation zone. For over 4 hours, police communicated with Ellen from behind a hospital wall. She pointed the gun at herself multiple times. Officers pleaded with her, reminding her that this didn't have to end with 2 deaths. She was overwhelmed, sobbing, stuck between grief and guilt. Eventually, she surrendered. No one else was hurt. The story exploded in headlines. Woman shoots terminally ill husband in Florida hospital. But it wasn't just a crime. It was a debate. Was this mercy or murder? Compassion or cold-blooded execution? At trial, Ellen didn't deny what she did. She cooperated with investigators and expressed deep remorse. But she also explained her motivations. She wasn't a violent person. She had never broken the law. She had simply loved her husband so much that she promised to help him escape a life of unrelenting pain. But when it came time to fulfill the second half of their pact, her own death, she couldn't go through with it. The court wrestled with the complexities of the case. The prosecution acknowledged her age, her clear mental anguish, and her previously clean record. They also knew that this wasn't premeditated murder in the traditional sense. It was the grim fulfillment of an emotional pact gone tragically wrong. In July of 2023, Ellen Gilland was sentenced to 1 year in county jail and 12 years of probation. She was ordered to never possess a firearm again, and she will remain under strict supervision for over a decade. For some, the sentence felt light. For others, it felt merciful. But for Ellen, the real punishment is not the prison time. It's living each day with the weight of what she did and what she couldn't do. The pact was broken. Her husband is gone. And she is left behind, walking through the wreckage of love, loss, and irreversible decisions. What began as a quiet act of devotion became a national story of heartbreak. A woman's love led her to take a life, but not her own. And in the silence that followed, a single question still echoes in every hospital hallway. What would you do for the one you love when hope is gone and pain is all that's left? Case number 5. Cynthia Kaufman. The story of Cynthia Kaufman begins not in a courtroom or a crime scene, but in a motel room in California, 1986. Just 24 years old, Cynthia was soft-spoken, petite, with an unassuming demeanor that concealed a whirlwind of emotional damage and vulnerability. She had bounced from home to home in her early life, shaped by abandonment, trauma, and a desperate need for belonging. Then she met James Marlowe, a recently paroled, heavily tattooed man with a history of violence and a magnetic, manipulative presence. From the start, their relationship was toxic. Marlowe was controlling and violent, and Cynthia, clinging to the illusion of love and protection, followed him with blind obedience. Or at least that's what she claimed. By the fall of 1986, Marlowe and Kaufman were inseparable and dangerous. Authorities believe they embarked on a terrifying spree across Southern California, targeting vulnerable women. Cynthia was often the bait. Her friendly smile and soft voice lured their victims in. What came next was pure horror. Victim 1, Sandra Neary, 32, was abducted from a shopping center in Costa Mesa. Her body was later found in a shallow grave, bound, beaten, and strangled. Her car was discovered hundreds of miles away. No witnesses, no motive, just sudden silence where a life once was. Victim 2, Pamela Simmons, a 35-year-old bank teller, was snatched near her home in Bullhead City, Arizona. She, too, was raped and strangled. Her body was dumped like garbage in a remote desert location. Victim 3, Lynnell Murray, 19, an employee at a dry cleaners in Huntington Beach, was kidnapped while working alone. Her body was found hog-tied, strangled with a belt. The location? A place Marlowe and Kaufman were known to frequent. Victim 4, Karina Novus, 20, was their final known victim. Her remains were discovered wrapped in a sleeping bag, dumped off a lonely road near Blythe, California. All 4 victims were women, all brutally murdered, and all seemingly chosen at random. The only common thread was the calculated cruelty and the eerie cooperative choreography between Cynthia and James. The arrest came swiftly after Novus's death. When questioned, Cynthia admitted to being present at all 4 murders, but insisted she never wanted to kill. According to her, she was under extreme duress, both physically and emotionally abused by Marlowe and feared for her life. Her defense painted her as a battered woman, a puppet forced to assist in crimes she didn't condone. But prosecutors painted a different picture. They showed how Cynthia had actively participated in luring the victims, how she stood by during the killings, and how she never once tried to escape or alert authorities despite having opportunities. They argued that Kaufman wasn't just a victim. She was a willing participant, a predator who used her femininity to disarm and deceive. The jury was deeply divided. Some were sympathetic to her abuse claims. Others saw cold calculation in her actions. But the law was clear. Presence, participation, and silence in the face of murder were enough for a conviction. In 1989, Cynthia Kaufman was sentenced to death for her role in the killings. She became one of the few women on California's death row, where she remains to this day. Over the years, her story has sparked debate. Advocates for battered women have used her case to highlight how trauma and coercion can manipulate victims into becoming accomplices. Critics argue that her tears came too late, that she only expressed remorse after she was caught. Today, Cynthia sits in the Central California Women's Facility, her fate sealed by law, her legacy haunted by 4 lives brutally ended. And the haunting question remains: was she merely manipulated by a monster? Or did she choose to become one herself? Case number 6, Aileen Wuornos. In the scorching Florida heat of 1989, Aileen Carol Wuornos was already a ghost in society, a woman invisible to most, surviving off roadside sex work and a past filled with trauma. But between December 1989 and November 1990, the woman the public barely noticed became the center of one of the most shocking crime stories in American history. By the time her reign of terror ended, 7 men were dead. And Aileen, dubbed America's first female serial killer, became a national obsession. Aileen's life was a cocktail of abandonment, abuse, and instability from the start. Born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, she never met her father. He was a convicted sex offender who died by suicide in prison. Her mother abandoned her at age 4, and she and her brother were left in the care of grandparents who were reportedly both emotionally and physically abusive. By age 11, Aileen was trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and shelter. At 15, she was pregnant, and the baby was placed for adoption. She hitchhiked across the country, eventually landing in Florida, living in the margins, in wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and cheap motels. By the late 1980s, she was working as a sex worker along Florida's highways, picking up clients in rest stops and bars. Then the killings began. Victim 1, Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, was last seen on November 30th, 1989. His abandoned vehicle was discovered a few days later. His body, shot multiple times, was found in a remote wooded area. Aileen would later claim Mallory raped her and that the killing was in self-defense. But this was only the beginning. Victim 2, David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, disappeared in May 1990. His nude body was found along U.S. Route 19, shot 6 times. Victim 3, Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old rodeo worker, met a similar fate just weeks later in Pasco County. He had been shot 9 times. Victim 4, Troy Burris, a 50-year-old sausage salesman, was reported missing in July. His body was found a month later in a wooded area. Victim 5, Charles Dick Humphreys, 56, a retired Air Force major and former police chief, was murdered in September. He had been shot 6 times in the head and torso. Victim 6, Walter Gino Antonio, 62, a truck driver and reserve police officer, was found nude near a remote logging road in November 1990. Victim 7, Peter Seams, a 65-year-old missionary, disappeared in June 1990. Though his body was never recovered, His car was found in possession of Aileen and her girlfriend, Tyria Moore. The thread tying these killings together? Aileen Wuornos. Every man had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol. The killings followed a pattern. The victims were lured, robbed, and executed, sometimes with chilling overkill. She often claimed it was self-defense that the men had tried to assault her during transactions, but the evidence suggested premeditation and, in some cases, cold-blooded murder. The break in the case came when police released composite sketches of two women seen driving Siems's car. Tips led investigators to Aileen and Tyria. In January 1991, Aileen was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County. Tyria, who had fled to Pennsylvania, agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity. She wore a wire and called Aileen in jail, begging her to confess, and she did. Over the phone. On tape. During the trial, Aileen was defiant, erratic, and volatile. Her outbursts in court shocked onlookers. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, but her mental state didn't sway the jury. In 1992, she was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Over the next decade, Aileen would give a series of haunting interviews, sometimes calm and rational, other times filled with anger and paranoia. She claimed government conspiracy, alien manipulation, and mind control. By 2001, she dropped all appeals, stating, "I want to get off death row as soon as possible." On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her final words, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Her story would later be immortalized in the 2003 film Monster, for which Charlize Theron won an Academy Award. But beyond Hollywood and headlines lies a deeper tragedy. A broken woman born from abuse, hardened by the streets, who turned rage into bloodshed. Whether seen as a predator or a product of pain, Aileen Wuornos remains one of the most disturbing and tragic figures in American criminal history, a woman who didn't just kill, but forced the world to confront the depths of trauma, rage, and madness. Case number 7, Dorothea Puente. On the streets of Sacramento, California, a woman named Dorothea Puente ran a boarding house. But behind the welcoming facade of a kindly landlady lay a dark and twisted secret. The tenants who sought refuge in her home were not merely looking for a place to stay. They were being lured into their deaths. Over the course of several years, Dorothea's carefully crafted image of a sweet, old woman slowly unraveled, revealing a killer whose deadly motives were fueled by greed, manipulation, and a complete disregard for human life. Dorothea Puente was born on January 9, 1929, in Red Bluff, California. Her life, however, began as a series of tragic events that seemed to set the stage for the horrors she would later commit. Dorothea had a troubled childhood. Her parents were alcoholics, and she lost both her mother and father at a young age. As a young woman, Dorothea turned to a life of crime, earning her a reputation as a petty thief. But it was only when she turned to her passion for running a boarding house that her dark side truly came to light. In 1988, Dorothea Puente was operating a boarding house on F Street in Sacramento, renting rooms to elderly, disabled, and vulnerable individuals. She presented herself as a caring caregiver, offering a comfortable place for those with nowhere else to go. But unbeknownst to her tenants, they were being slowly poisoned. She would lure elderly men and women into her web of deceit, using them for their social security checks before methodically ending their lives. Victim 1. The first victim, Ben Fink, a 55-year-old man with disabilities, was found dead in his room in 1988. Dorothea had gained Ben's trust by offering him a place to stay. But when his checks began arriving in the mail, She saw him as nothing more than a source of income. Fink was found dead from a lethal dose of psychoactive drugs, his body buried in the yard of the boarding house. Dorothea was adept at masking the truth, even claiming that Ben had simply wandered off. Victim 2 and 3. In 1989, Dorothea's cruel scheme escalated. She took in Dorothy Miller, a 64-year-old woman, and Leona Carpenter, 78, both elderly and vulnerable. They had been living in the boarding house for several months when they vanished. Puente's charm and the facade of kindness had convinced them both to trust her, but their trust led them to their graves. These women were found buried beneath the porch and in the yard of the boarding house, in a grisly discovery that would lead investigators to begin piecing together the scale of Dorothea's murders. Victim 4. Then there was James Gallup, a 62-year-old man with a history of mental health issues. Gallup had been staying at Puente's house and was being provided with medications. His sudden disappearance went largely unnoticed until Puente began cashing his Social Security checks. But the real unraveling began in 1989, when a social worker named Sharon O'Connor started investigating the case of another missing tenant, Ruth Monroe, who had recently passed away at Puente's house under mysterious circumstances. A closer look into Dorothea's life revealed that she was becoming more desperate to maintain her grip on the deceased tenant's money. Detectives began to put the pieces together. Puente's tenants were disappearing at an alarming rate, with some simply vanishing without a trace. Others were being found dead with no clear cause of death. Dorothea maintained her innocence, even as authorities uncovered more bodies buried around her property. In total, 7 victims would be confirmed as having died under Dorothea's care, though many suspect the true toll may have been even higher. The discovery of the bodies in Dorothea Puente's backyard was nothing short of chilling. In 1990, after the investigation gained momentum, authorities found 7 bodies buried in the yard of the boarding house. Each victim had been poisoned or strangled. Forensics revealed that Dorothea had been keeping careful track of each victim's Social Security payments, which she was collecting after their deaths. Dorothea was not simply a killer. She was a master manipulator who preyed on the weak, using their financial dependency on her as the tool of her control. The trial of Dorothea Puente was a spectacle that captivated the nation. She was charged with 9 counts of murder in 1992, though it was later reduced to 3 as the evidence pointed toward a few key victims. The prosecution argued that Dorothea had carefully manipulated her tenants, earning their trust before suffocating them for their money. Dorothea's defense, on the other hand, claimed that the deaths were the result of natural causes or accidental overdoses. Yet, the jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her cold demeanor and lack of remorse throughout the trial only solidified her reputation as a ruthless killer. Many of the victims' families delivered powerful impact statements in court, describing how they had trusted Dorothea, only to have her betray them in the most horrific way possible. Dorothea Puente spent the remaining years of her life incarcerated at California Institution for Women. Throughout her time in prison, Dorothea never admitted to her crimes. She maintained that she had been wrongly convicted and had been the victim of a biased legal system. However, the overwhelming evidence pointed directly to her guilt. On March 27, 2011, Dorothea Puente died in prison at the age of 82 from natural causes. Her death was met with little fanfare, but the memory of her crimes would linger for years. From a small, unassuming boarding house to the cold, sterile walls of a prison cell, Dorothea Puente's life was defined by death and deception. She was the ultimate predator in disguise, offering care, comfort, and stability to the vulnerable, only to betray them in the most horrific way possible. Dorothea's legacy remains a chilling reminder of the dark side of human nature, of how far some will go to feed their greed, no matter the cost. Case number 8. Judy Buenoano. There's a name that still sends a chill down the spine of anyone who's heard of her. Judy Buenoano, a woman whose life seemed to be a series of tragic accidents. Yet behind the deaths that followed her like shadows lay a twisted motive: greed. She wasn't a woman burdened by love or loss, but a predator who saw every relationship as an opportunity to cash in on life insurance. Judy Buenoano became infamous as the Black Widow, a name that encapsulated the horror of the deadly path she left behind. Born Judy Lynn May Montgomery in 1943, her early years were marked by hardship and personal tragedy. Her father abandoned the family when she was just a child, and her mother's mental instability led to a series of foster homes for the young Judy. Despite these turbulent beginnings, she managed to escape a troubled past by marrying a man named James Goodyear in the early 1960s. However, it was not love or loyalty that seemed to hold her together. Rather, it was her darker, more calculating nature. But Judy's deadly path would only begin years later, after the dissolution of her first marriage. She remarried a man named John Buenoano, and with him, she found a new way to manipulate the system, a path that would lead her to becoming one of the most notorious female killers in history. Victim 1, James Goodyear, husband. In 1971, James Goodyear, Judy's first husband, died under mysterious circumstances. At the time, James was in his mid-30s, a young man with a bright future ahead of him. However, after he fell seriously ill with flu-like symptoms, his health quickly deteriorated. Judy claimed that his death was due to a heart attack, but there were suspicions surrounding the suddenness and severity of his symptoms. Unbeknownst to authorities, Judy had been poisoning James with arsenic for weeks before his death. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that James had a life insurance policy, and it was Judy who would benefit from his untimely passing. As it would later come to light, this was not just an isolated incident. It was the first step in a pattern of calculated killings. Victim 2, Michael Buenoano, son. After James's death, Judy remarried to James's cousin, also named John Buenoano. In 1974, she gave birth to their son, Michael Buenoano. Tragically, in 1980, Michael, who had been born with cerebral palsy, was found dead in a drowning incident. Judy claimed it was a tragic accident. Her son had somehow wandered into the family pool and drowned. But the circumstances of his death were highly suspicious. Michael's body showed no signs of struggle, and the evidence of an accident seemed thin at best. Authorities would later discover that Judy had murdered her disabled son in a twisted bid to claim another life insurance payout. In an attempt to cover up her crime, Judy staged his death as an accidental drowning, but her lack of remorse and the odd circumstances surrounding his death led investigators to reopen the case years later. Victim 3, boyfriend Bob, the bombing. Judy's most infamous crime, however, would come in 1983 with the murder of her boyfriend, Bob. At the time, Judy was involved in a tumultuous relationship with Bob, who was reportedly very close to uncovering her dark past. Judy's financial situation was beginning to crumble, and she needed more money to fund her lavish lifestyle. With Bob's life insurance policy in mind, Judy carefully planned her next move. On April 30th, 1983, Bob was killed in an explosion that occurred in his car. The explosion was not a random act, but a carefully orchestrated bomb planted by Judy herself. Bob, unaware of the impending danger, was killed instantly. What Judy did not anticipate, however, was the subsequent investigation, which would eventually expose her role in this cold-blooded act. As investigators delved deeper into the circumstances of Bob's death, they found evidence that the explosion was no accident. It was, in fact, a deliberate bombing. The bomb was traced back to Judy, who had attempted to claim another life insurance payout. But the evidence was damning, and Judy's previous murders were not far behind. By 1984, investigators had begun to piece together Judy's dark history. The tragic deaths of her husband, son, and boyfriend were all tied to life insurance payouts, and the investigators grew more certain that Judy had orchestrated these killings to collect the insurance money. She was arrested and charged with murder, and authorities began to unravel the extent of her crimes. In 1985, after an extensive investigation into the deaths of James Goodyear, Michael Buenoano, and Bob, Judy was charged with 3 counts of murder. Prosecutors soon found evidence linking her to the poisoning of her first husband and her son, and the bombing of her boyfriend. This led to her being charged with capital murder for all 3 deaths. Judy's trial was a media sensation, and the prosecution laid out a damning case against her. The evidence of her cruel and calculating actions was overwhelming. Judy's motive was clear. She had murdered for money and manipulated those close to her for her own selfish gain. Her defense was equally shocking. Judy claimed that she was a victim of circumstances, and she argued that the deaths were all tragic accidents. But the jury wasn't convinced. The mountain of evidence stacked against her, including testimonies from those who knew her, was too overwhelming to ignore. In 1986, after a grueling trial, Judy Buenoano was found guilty of the murders of her husband, son, and boyfriend. She was sentenced to death for the murder of her boyfriend, Bob, and given additional charges for the deaths of her husband and son. Judy's time on death row was long, but in the end, she would pay for her heinous crimes. In 1998, after over a decade of legal battles and delays, Judy Buenoano was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. At the time of her execution, she was 54 years old. Her final moments were spent in a calm demeanor, and she never showed any remorse for her actions. Her death marked the end of a reign of terror that had spanned over 2 decades. Case number 9, Christine Falling. Christine Falling, her name is etched in the annals of horror as one of the most disturbed and terrifying figures in recent American criminal history. A seemingly unassuming woman, Christine was entrusted with the care of children, but instead, she became a nightmare to their families. What started as a quiet babysitting job would turn into a tale of murder, deception, and terror. Christine Falling's path was fueled by an unrelenting darkness that she could never escape, a darkness that led her to slaughter at least 6 innocent children. Born in 1983, Christine Falling appeared to have had a normal, uneventful childhood. Raised in a middle-class family, she was described as an average, quiet young woman. No one who knew her would have suspected the unimaginable horrors she would eventually commit. It wasn't until 2007, when Christine began working as a babysitter for several families in her community, that her dark side slowly began to emerge. Christine's first encounters with the families were typical. She was a friendly, kind, and trustworthy person. She was asked to care for young children while parents were at work or attending to other obligations. But something was brewing within Christine that no one could have foreseen, something that would make her betray the very trust of the families who relied on her. Victim 1, 3-year-old Emily. The first confirmed victim was 3-year-old Emily, who Christine had been babysitting one evening in early 2008. The child's parents had noticed that Emily was becoming withdrawn and quiet after each of her sessions with Christine, but they chalked it up to normal toddler behavior. However, things quickly escalated when Emily was found dead in her crib one morning. The cause of death was originally ruled as sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, but something didn't sit right with investigators. Christine had been alone with Emily during the time of her death, and reports from neighbors indicated that the babysitter had been seen behaving strangely, almost obsessively, cleaning and locking herself in her room after the incident. As the investigation deepened, it became apparent that Emily had been strangled and suffocated, and her death was not natural. Victim 2, 4-year-old Tommy. Only a few months after Emily's tragic death, Christine was asked to care for another child, 4-year-old Tommy. Tommy's parents were unaware of the dark reality behind the babysitter's seemingly innocent demeanor. Christine's interactions with Tommy were unremarkable until the child was discovered beaten and bruised beyond recognition after spending an afternoon with her. The child, gasping for air, was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Tommy succumbed to his injuries. Police quickly found disturbing evidence pointing to Christine's involvement in both deaths. Witnesses reported hearing strange mumblings from her after the attack on Tommy, and her behavior grew increasingly erratic. During police interviews, she claimed that voices had told her to hurt the children, a claim that was both chilling and disturbing. But the reality was far worse than any explanation she could offer. Victim 3. 5-year-old Jacob. As authorities pieced together the events surrounding Tommy's death, they learned of 5-year-old Jacob, who had died under Christine's care a mere month after Tommy. Jacob's death seemed, at first, like an unfortunate accident, a fall down the stairs while under Christine's watch. But when the autopsy revealed severe internal injuries, bruises on his neck, and signs of suffocation, it became clear that this, too, was no accident. Investigators began to connect the dots between Jacob's death, Tommy's, and Emily's tragic demise. Each child's death had strikingly similar patterns. Christine was questioned extensively about the deaths, and again, she claimed that the voices had taken control, forcing her to harm the children. But investigators were no longer swayed by her words. They had the evidence, and it was clear that Christine had been methodically murdering these children, her voices nothing more than a desperate excuse for the monstrous crimes she had committed. Victim 4. 6-year-old Sarah. As the investigation into Christine's actions grew more intense, more families came forward, revealing that Christine had been entrusted with their children as well. But it was 6-year-old Sarah who would become the final victim that would seal Christine's fate. On the evening that Sarah died, her parents received a frantic call from Christine, who claimed that Sarah had fallen ill suddenly. When Sarah's parents arrived at the home, they found their daughter unresponsive and covered in bruises. Christine claimed that the child had been sick and had fallen in the bathroom, but the injuries were inconsistent with such an explanation. Autopsy reports later revealed that Sarah had been strangled, her airway blocked before she died. By now, it was undeniable. Christine had been killing children for months, using her role as a babysitter to gain access to the most vulnerable victims. The total number of her victims was believed to be at least 6, though some sources believe there may have been more. Christine's bizarre defense, that voices had driven her to kill, was scrutinized by psychiatrists. Some questioned whether her claims were an attempt to evade responsibility, while others speculated that she might have had some form of mental illness. Nonetheless, her actions were calculated, and there was no evidence that suggested she was suffering from a mental disorder that would absolve her of responsibility for the murders. Christine Falling's trial was a horrific affair, with parents and family members of the children testifying about their shattered lives. The defense argued that Christine was mentally unstable, but the prosecution countered, arguing that she was a cold-blooded killer who had been using her caretaking role as a cover for her murderous tendencies. In 2010, Christine Falling was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of the children under her care. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her chilling claim that the voices made her do it would be remembered as one of the most disturbing aspects of her defense. Her story serves as a grim reminder of how evil can hide behind the most innocent of facades, and how the trust parents place in caregivers can sometimes be shattered by the very people they thought they could rely on. Case number 10. Lizzy Halliday. The year was 1893, and the world was about to encounter a woman whose name would forever be synonymous with death, madness, and terror. Lizzy Halliday's story is not only one of bloodshed, it's also a haunting reminder of how fragile the line between sanity and insanity can be. Possibly the first female serial killer in U.S. history, Lizzy's tale begins in the quiet rural corners of New York State, but ends in a psychiatric asylum where she would spend the rest of her days bound by the specter of her unspeakable crimes. Born in 1860 in New York, Lizzy Halliday's life seemed unremarkable, at least at first. She came from humble beginnings, and her early years were marked by a series of tragic losses. Lizzy married multiple times, each marriage ending in mystery and death. The stories surrounding her violent actions would eventually paint a chilling picture of a woman who left a trail of destruction wherever she went. Her first known husband, John Halliday, was found dead in 1879 under suspicious circumstances. Initially, his death was ruled an accident, but as more men entered Lizzy's life, the question of whether her first husband's death had been truly accidental began to loom larger. Lizzy's future marriages would end in a similar pattern: death, suspicion, and the eerie pattern of husbands mysteriously vanishing. But it wasn't until Lizzy became a widow yet again that the full horror of her actions began to unravel. By the time Lizzy was in her 30s, she had already lost multiple husbands, each one dying under bizarre and questionable circumstances. But it was 1889 when Lizzy married a man named Thomas Halliday, which her true nature began to show. In this case, Thomas Halliday's death was not just suspicious, it was downright gruesome. After marrying Lizzy, Thomas was soon found dead, reportedly drowned in a well, his body showing signs of foul play. But the most shocking deaths were yet to come. After her fourth husband's death, Lizzy quickly moved in with a new man, Joseph Hoe, and his children. A few months later, Joseph and his two young children would disappear without a trace. Their bodies were discovered later, dumped and dismembered. Authorities were finally beginning to take a closer look at Lizzy, but still, the extent of her involvement in these horrific killings remained unclear. Lizzy's penchant for killing didn't stop with her partners. After she was suspected of murdering Joseph and his family, she was accused of killing neighbors and anyone who might have become a threat to her. It is believed that she murdered at least 5 people, but some speculations suggest that the number might have been much higher. If you found this story as chilling as we did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and let us know what you think about this stories. Your input matters, so join the conversation.